My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 67 years old, born in 1958 in Manchester, in the north of England. I grew up in a United Kingdom that still carried the emotional rubble of the Second World War, even though the streets had already been rebuilt. For my generation, the baby boomers' old stories were told as if they were legends, and silences weighed as much as words. My mother always said that my father had been a war hero, but never explained beyond that. No photos, no letters, no objects of his around the house. I grew up thinking that this meant Paynand, that it was better not to talk about it. But at 65, 2 years ago, I received a forgotten box in a public storage facility, a box addressed to my mother. Inside, I found the truth she had spent her whole life trying to hide from me. And that's where it all began. I was preparing my usual morning tea when the knock on the door startled me. At 67, surprises are rare in my routine, and the sound felt almost out of place in my quiet street in Manchester. When I opened the door, the postman stood there with a thin layer of frost on his cap and a large parcel in his hands. He asked my name, checked a small slip of paper, and handed me a box wrapped in brown paper that had clearly seen many years of storage. The label carried my mother's full name, Evelyn Grace Ellison. Seeing it written in her handwriting, even after all this time, unsettled something deep inside me. I brought the box to the kitchen table, letting the kettle continue to whistle on its own. For a long moment, I did not touch the parcel. My mother had been gone for a decade, and I had made peace with the idea that everything she wanted me to know had already been shared. She had been a private woman, shaped by post-war expectations and the pressure to keep home life steady, even when her heart was unsettled. I had accepted her quiet ways as part of the generation she came from. Yet here was a box that contradicted that belief, sealed with tape that had yellowed to the color of old wallpaper. When I finally opened it, I expected ordinary belongings, perhaps a forgotten scarf or receipts from the years she worked at the textile mill. Instead, the first thing I saw was a folded piece of fabric, a military handkerchief with initials stitched carefully in blue thread. Beneath it lay a photograph. I froze before even lifting it, because I knew instinctively that this was no family friend or distant relative. I had never seen an image of my father, not once in all my childhood. My mother's answer had always been that he died before I was born, and that speaking about him only brought her sorrow. As a child, I believed her. As an adult, I learned not to ask questions that caused pain. With a breath I had not noticed I was holding, I turned the photograph over. A man in uniform smiled at the camera, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the world would become gentler after the war. He looked young, far younger than my mother had ever been in the years I knew her. His features were familiar enough to unsettle me, the shape of my eyes, the line of my jaw. I had wondered all my life why I resembled no one in the Ellison family, and now, with a single image, the mystery seemed to shift into focus. Carefully, I placed the photograph aside and continued exploring the contents. Letters tied with a thin ribbon filled most of the space. The paper was fragile, the ink fading, yet every envelope bore the same name: Thomas Riley. I whispered it aloud, surprised by how natural it felt on my tongue, as though I had said it countless times in another life. My mother had never spoken that name, not once. I untied the ribbon with careful fingers. The first letter was dated 1962, a full 4 years after my birth. My mother had always said my father never lived to see me, that he passed before she realized she was expecting. But here he was writing about me as a small child, asking if I was healthy and if I had inherited her quiet determination. His tone was warm, steady, hopeful. He wrote of wanting to return to England, of finding a way to build a future with the two of us. I read the lines again and again, the words blurring as my eyes stung. The kettle had gone silent long ago, and the house felt colder, as though the truth inside the box had opened a window to the past. I reached for another letter. This one expressed uncertainty. He worried that my mother had stopped replying, that she no longer wished him to visit. He asked if she was safe, if I was growing, if the world had treated us kindly. There was no bitterness in his words, only confusion and concern. For years, I believed my mother carried a wound so deep that even time could not touch it. Now, for the first time, I realized that perhaps the wound had not been caused by losing him, but by choosing a path she believed necessary. The post-war decades in Britain were strict in their expectations. Women were judged harshly for decisions that did not fit neatly into the design of a respectable household. My mother had endured financial hardship, family pressure, and a society that rarely forgave women for choices made alone. Yet none of that explained why she hid the truth of my father from me entirely. At the bottom of the box lay a small notebook. It was bound with a simple string, the kind my mother used to tie her sewing materials. I hesitated before picking it up, unsure if I was prepared for any more revelations. But curiosity, mixed with a longing I had never been brave enough to acknowledge, guided my hand. The first page contained only a date written in my mother's elegant handwriting, the same handwriting she used on notes left in my school lunches. The entry began with a sentence that changed the rhythm of the room around me. I do not know if I am strong enough to tell Margaret the truth. I closed the notebook gently, letting the weight of her words settle. 67 years of life had taught me many lessons, but nothing prepared me for the quiet power of a secret kept for the sake of a child. And yet, as I stared at the box, I understood that discovering the truth was now my responsibility. Whatever she had been unable to say in life, I would uncover in my own time. The kettle was cold, the tea untouched, but I remained seated at the table. The photograph beside me, the letters stacked neatly, and the notebook resting under my hand. My father, no longer a figure of silence, now existed in ink and paper, waiting for me to learn who he truly was. And in that moment, I felt something unexpected beginning. I spent most of that day sitting at my kitchen table, the letters spread before me like pieces of a life I had never been allowed to know. The afternoon light crept across the floor, dull and pale, the kind typical of Manchester winters. It felt as though the sun itself was cautious about entering the room, unsure if it should witness what I was uncovering. I picked up the first letter again, reading it slowly, tracing the curves of the handwriting, as if doing so would bring the man behind the words closer to me. My mother's voice echoed in my memory with painful clarity. She had always spoken of my father with a kind of distant sorrow, never giving details, never allowing me to ask too much. "He passed before you were born," she would say, ending the conversation before it truly began. For decades, I believed her. I built my understanding of family around the absence she insisted on. Yet here, in my hands, was proof that he had lived long enough to write about me, to worry, to hope. The date on the letter 1962 was unmistakable. I was 4 years old then, old enough to form memories, yet none of them contained him. I felt an uncomfortable mixture of betrayal and confusion. Could it be that she had chosen to keep him away, that she had constructed a version of events that suited the life she felt forced to lead? I unfolded the next letter, dated only months after the first. His tone had changed slightly. He still wrote with warmth, but now there was a thread of hesitation woven through the sentences. He mentioned that he had not heard from my mother in several weeks. He wondered whether she had moved, whether something had happened. He asked repeatedly if I was healthy, if I liked to read, if I still carried the small wooden toy he had sent the previous Christmas. I paused at that line. I had never received any toy from him, never seen anything resembling a gift that came from abroad. My mother must have hidden it, perhaps even disposed of it, believing it was easier to pretend he had never existed. As I turned the pages, I felt the weight of my childhood memories shifting. I had grown up in a modest terrace house, raised by a woman who worked tirelessly to give me stability. She took extra shifts at the textile mill, made meals stretch, and ensured I never felt unloved. But now I wondered what she had sacrificed and what choices she had made in silence. For years she carried her burdens without explanation. Only now did I suspect one of those burdens was the truth about my father. I continued reading until I reached a letter that made my hands tremble slightly. In it, my father wrote that he had secured temporary work and was saving money for a trip. "I will come to Manchester before the year ends," he promised. "I want Margaret to know me as more than words on paper." Those lines felt like a quiet blow to my chest. There was no record in my memory of a visitor, no story from my mother about someone searching for us. If he had come, she had kept it from me. If he had not, something must have stopped him. The letter ended with hope, but a hopeful man cannot remain hopeful forever. I reached for the next envelope, dated early the following year. His handwriting remained steady, but the tone had changed drastically. He wrote of arriving in England and finding no forwarding address. My mother had moved 3 streets away, a short distance by any measure, but enough to make her unreachable if she wished to be. The thought of him walking past our old home, perhaps more than once, perhaps waiting for a glimpse of us, made my throat tighten. She had made sure he would never find us again. The final letter in the bundle was brief, almost hesitant, as though he had run out of places to send his words. He wrote that he was preparing to leave the country for work opportunities abroad. He did not blame my mother. He did not accuse her. He simply expressed sadness that he had failed to see me and hoped that I would grow up surrounded by kindness. It was the gentleness of that hope that unsettled me most. I sat back in my chair, letting the letters rest in a neat pile. The room felt different now, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the truth alongside me. I had lived 67 years believing one version of my father's story, only to learn that it had been shaped by omission. My mother had carried her reasons to the grave, reasons I still could not fully grasp. Yet part of me understood that life in post-war Britain had not been simple for women like her. Expectations were rigid, judgments swift. Being a young mother alone was difficult enough, navigating complicated relationships even more so. Still, knowing that did not soften the ache I felt. A gap existed between what she believed was best and what I, as her daughter, needed to know. I stood and walked to the living room, carrying the photograph of my father with me. I placed it on the mantelpiece, its frame still absent, the edges worn but intact. For the first time in my life, his face rested in my home, no longer hidden in a forgotten box. As the evening settled, I returned to the kitchen and opened my mother's notebook once more. The words from the first page lingered in my mind, their meaning growing heavier with each passing hour. If she had doubted her strength to tell me the truth, then I would now have to find the strength to uncover it. The letters had revealed the first lie. The deeper reasons remained in the pages of the notebook, waiting for me to read them and piece together the story my mother never dared to share, and I knew that once I continued, there would be no turning back. I woke the next morning earlier than usual, unable to quiet my thoughts. The letters had shifted the ground beneath my feet, and although the house looked unchanged, it felt as if I were living inside a memory that did not belong to me. I made tea, though I barely tasted it, and carried the photograph of my father to the living room window where the soft grey light of Manchester filtered through the curtains. His smile seemed almost out of place in the stillness of the morning, as if it belonged to another life entirely. For decades, I had lived with the belief that my father had died before I took my first breath. My mother had repeated that story so consistently that I never questioned it. It was part of the fabric of my life, woven tightly into childhood, stitched into every answer she gave when relatives asked about my origins. But now I had a name, Thomas Ryleand. The presence of that name felt like opening a door that had been sealed shut intentionally. As I stood by the window, I whispered it aloud again. There was a strange comfort in saying it, as though I was speaking to someone I had been waiting for without realizing it. The letters had shown me a man who cared deeply, who wrote with sincerity and hope. Yet the name had been hidden from me as if it were dangerous, as if knowing it would disrupt something my mother had spent years protecting. I placed the photograph carefully on the mantel and returned to the box. The letters lay in a neat pile, sorted by date, but beneath them I noticed a small envelope I had overlooked. It was thinner than the others, sealed but unmarked. For a moment I hesitated, wondering if this was something my mother herself had added to the box, something she had never meant to be found. But the purpose of the box itself contradicted that fear. If she had truly wanted everything to remain hidden, she would never have preserved it for so many years. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper containing a single sentence written in my mother's steady handwriting. "You must forgive me one day." No explanation, no date, no context, just a plea. My throat tightened as I read it again. It made everything feel more human, more tragic. Whatever choice she had made, she had not made it lightly. I placed the note aside and reached for the notebook again. The second page held an entry written in slightly hurried handwriting, as if she had been afraid of losing her nerve. She wrote about meeting Thomas near the end of the war, about the uncertainty of those years, and how the world was rebuilding itself in pieces. He had been stationed briefly near her hometown, and their relationship formed quickly, as many did during that turbulent period. She described him as gentle, attentive, and determined to build something lasting. Reading her words, I saw a younger version of my mother, hopeful, uncertain, and perhaps more vulnerable than I had ever imagined her to be. But then the tone shifted. She wrote about her parents disapproving of him, about their concerns regarding the instability of military life, about the financial struggles many returning soldiers faced. She wrote about the pressure placed on her to return home, to maintain appearances, to choose the safer, more accepted path. Her words were not dramatic, only honest. She confessed that she felt torn between the life she wanted and the life she was expected to uphold. I turned the page slowly. On the next entry, she wrote about her fear of raising me alone if he were sent abroad again. She worried he would leave for good, not by choice, but by circumstance, and that she would be left with heartbreak and responsibility. She had seen neighbors struggle after their husbands left for distant assignments. In that entry, she admitted that fear guided her more than reason, more than love. She wrote that distancing herself felt like the only decision she could control. As I read, I felt an ache I could not easily name. Her words were not cruel or cold, they were filled with conflict. I imagined her reading his letters and refusing to respond, knowing each decision widened the distance between them. She must have suffered with each envelope she left unopened. Yet she had chosen silence, believing it would give me the stable life she thought was right. Closing the notebook softly, I rested it on my lap. I understood the pressures of her time, the expectations placed on women, especially young mothers with limited choices. But understanding did not erase the hurt. Knowing she had hidden the name Thomas Riley from me made me realize how deeply she had buried her own past, perhaps trying to protect us both in ways that no longer made sense. I picked up the photograph again and studied my father's face. For the first time, I wondered if he had known my name, if he ever pictured me growing older, if he imagined I might one day speak his name into a quiet room decades after his letters stopped coming. There was comfort in believing he had cared, and sorrow in knowing he had searched. The day passed in a slow, reflective haze. I found myself rearranging the letters, handling them carefully as though they were fragile pieces of something sacred. I read certain lines again, letting their meanings settle. His words about wanting to visit, his concern as her silence grew, his disappointment when he could no longer reach us. Those letters were a record of his presence in my life, even though I had never known it. By evening, I brought the box into the living room and set it beside the fire. The warmth from the hearth softened the tension in my shoulders, though it did nothing to settle the questions forming in my mind. I knew now that the name my mother had withheld held far more than identity. It held a history, a relationship, a version of life that had been reshaped deliberately. And I realized I needed to know why, not out of anger, but out of a need to understand the shape of my own story. The name she hid had found its way back to me, and it was only the beginning of everything I was about to learn. I did not sleep well that night. My mind circled around the letters, the notebook, and the name that had reshaped everything I thought I knew about my life. By dawn, the uneasy restlessness had grown into a quiet determination. I needed to know more. Not simply about my father as a man, but about his life outside the small window of letters he had written to my mother. If he had once served, if he had crossed oceans, if he had truly tried to find us, then there had to be a trace somewhere beyond the pages preserved in that fragile box. I brewed a fresh pot of tea and sat at my desk, pulling my laptop closer. Although I had never been particularly skilled with technology, the idea of searching military records felt like the only logical step. My hands trembled slightly as I typed his name into the official archives. Thomas Riley, a common enough name, one that appeared often across various records. But his details, his handwriting, his tone, even the dates in the letters gave me hints to narrow the search. For a long while, the screen loaded slowly, the familiar spinning icon testing my patience. Then, lines of information began to appear. Each entry felt like opening a door to a world I had never been invited into. I scrolled carefully, reading through the entries that matched his age and origin. Eventually, one record made me stop. It matched the time frame my mother had described when speaking vaguely about her younger years, though she had never offered specifics. The record stated that he had enlisted in the final phase of the war, serving primarily in logistical supporter position far from the front lines, yet difficult in its own way. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness reading it. He had served, but not in the dramatic way war stories often depict. His duty seemed steady, grounded, marked by long hours and constant movement. The record mentioned he had been stationed for a brief period in northwestern England, aligning perfectly with what my mother wrote in her notebook. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the information. Although these details did not portray a heroic figure in the traditional sense, they painted a portrait of a man living through a turbulent era, trying to create stability in a world that often lacked it. It felt fitting, almost poetic, that this was the man who had written letters filled with patience and longing. But as I scrolled further, I found something that made my breath hitch. His records did not end in the early 1950s, as I had expected. There were post-war entries, routine updates, changes in address, employment notes, small fragments that showed he had remained in the system long after leaving active service. And then, in 1963, one line stood out: Emigration approved, destination, Canada. I stared at those words for a long time. So my father had left the country shortly after his final letter, the one in which he wrote about searching for us and failing. The timing aligned too neatly to be a coincidence. My mother moved. He arrived too late. He lost both of us not because he abandoned us, but because he no longer knew where we were. A deep ache settled in my chest. I imagined him standing on some unfamiliar street in Manchester, asking strangers if they knew Evelyn Ellison, hoping someone might point him in the right direction. But the truth was harsher. My mother had not just withdrawn from him emotionally, she had physically removed us from his reach. Whether out of fear, shame, or simply a desire to close that chapter of her life, she had ensured that he would never find us. I clicked on the emigration file and discovered that he had obtained work upon arrival, first in a factory in Ontario and later in a small administrative role for a railway company. His life seemed quiet, stable, modest. Knowing this brought me an unexpected comfort. He had built something for himself. He had lived, worked, and contributed, none of which my mother ever spoke of. Yet, beneath that comfort, I felt a pang of grief. He had lived for decades without knowing where I was or who I had become. The thought that he might have wondered about me into his final years made my eyes sting. I turned away from the screen for a moment and looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. The young man in the uniform had no idea of the life that awaited him, no idea that his child would spend decades unaware of his existence. It felt profoundly unfair, not in an angry way, but in a deeply human one. Returning to the laptop, I searched for any mention of family marriages, children, or other relatives. The records confirmed that years after emigrating, he had married someone in Canada. This part did not surprise me. People rebuild. They continue. They find new beginnings. Still, seeing that he had formed a life far away, separate from anything I had known, stirred a mixture of emotions I struggled to untangle. Knowing all this did not diminish the love and dedication my mother had given me, but it revealed the complexity she had hidden behind silence. Her choices had shaped not only her life but mine as well. And perhaps she believed that by shielding me from uncertainty, she was sparing me pain. Yet pain finds its way to us in different forms, and sometimes the truth withheld hurts more than the truth itself. As the afternoon light began to fade, I saved the information I had found and closed the laptop gently. The room felt heavier now, filled with the weight of a story I was only beginning to understand. I realized that discovering these records had not provided closure. Instead, they opened another door, path leading further into the past, into the hidden corners of decisions made long before I could question them. The name I had spoken quietly the day before was no longer just a name. It was a life, a history, a man who had tried to reach me across time. And now that I knew where he had gone, I sensed that the next step would be learning who he had become. I woke before sunrise that morning, the pale light filtering through the cracks in the shutters of the small house where we had taken shelter. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, and for a moment I felt as if time had paused. It was one of the few mornings in which distant tension had softened just enough for me to hear my own breathing. I sat on the edge of the cot, letting my feet rest on the cool floorboards, trying to understand why that particular day felt heavier than the others. Perhaps it was because I had spent the night turning over memories I had tried to ignore, voices from home, laughter from quieter days, and the echo of goodbyes I never had the chance to frame properly. As I stepped outside, the cold air brushed across my face, waking me fully. A layer of frost covered the garden behind the house, glimmering in the early light like a thin veil. I walked toward the fence, running my hand along the weathered wood, grounding myself in something that felt solid. Although the region remained unsettled, our surroundings were calm enough for the moment, and I knew I needed to make use of that calm. I had responsibilities, supplies to check, messages to organize, and the constant duty of keeping my group focused on staying safe. When I returned to the main room, the others were already awake, seated around a simple table marked with scratches and small burns from long past owners. I greeted them quietly and reviewed our plans for the day. We intended to travel only a short distance, scouting the nearby road for any signs of movement. Our goal was never confrontation, but awareness, the kind of awareness that could help us avoid unnecessary danger. Every choice had to reflect caution. Every step had to follow the same principle: stay alert, stay steady, and avoid placing anyone at risk. Once our tasks were divided, I stepped aside to gather my thoughts. I could sense the weight on everyone's shoulders, but there was also a resilience I deeply admired. I found myself thinking about how much we had changed since arriving in this region. The first days had been filled with disorientation and fear, as if we were navigating a landscape that refused to reveal its intentions. Yet with time, we learned how to listen not only to the environment, but to one another. We grew patient, resourceful, and aware that each decision shaped our ability to continue forward. By late morning, we set off, moving along the narrow path behind the property. The air had warmed slightly, though a crisp breeze kept us alert. I walked at the front, paying attention to the soft sound of boots on the frozen earth. The trees around us formed a natural corridor, their branches bending overhead like arches. Now and then a bird darted through the undergrowth, reminding me that life persisted even in uncertain circumstances. After an hour of steady walking, we reached a ridge that overlooked the road. From this vantage point, we could observe without being exposed. I knelt behind a cluster of tall grass and studied the long stretch below us. The road remained empty, uninterrupted by vehicles or travelers, and I felt a quiet relief settle in my chest. Still, I stayed focused. Even peaceful moments required discipline. I monitored the horizon carefully, marking details in my mind, unwilling to let distraction compromise our safety. We remained there for a while, each of us scanning a different section of the landscape. The silence allowed my mind to wander again, drifting to memories I hadn't visited in years. I thought of my family, of the people who shaped me long before these experiences. I remembered my parents' steady voices, my siblings' restless questions, the small arguments that seemed monumental at the time but now felt almost comforting. There was something strangely grounding about recalling ordinary moments. They reminded me why I wanted to remain strong, why I kept moving with determination. When we finally decided to head back, the sun had already begun its slow descent. Shadows stretched long across the path, creating patterns that shifted with every step. We walked at a relaxed pace, feeling less pressure than we had in previous days. Yet even as we approached the house, a subtle tension began to creep back into me. Calm days always carried the possibility of change. Experience had taught me never to assume predictability. Inside, we warmed our hands by the small stove and reviewed what we had seen. The absence of movement on the road was encouraging, but we agreed that vigilance remained necessary. I noted every detail in my journal, careful to record only factual observations that would help guide future choices. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just the simple clarity needed to stay responsible and prepared. As evening settled in, I stepped outside once more. The sky had deepened to a muted blue, and the first stars were emerging. I let my breath steady while I stared upward, reflecting on how much each day shaped the next. I knew the challenges ahead would require patience, restraint, and the willingness to adapt without losing hope. I was tired, but not defeated. And in that moment of quiet, surrounded by the cold air and the distant hum of nightfall, I made a silent promise to remain steady for myself, for the group, and for the memory of everything we had lost and hoped to preserve. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt unusual. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure whether I had slept deeply or simply drifted through the hours in a haze. The room remained dim, the shutters half closed, and the air carrying a faint scent of cold stone. For a few breaths I stayed motionless, listening to the muted sounds around me, the soft creak of wood settling, the faint rustle of someone shifting in the next room. It was a reminder that even in calm moments, life continued in small, persistent ways. After gathering my thoughts, I stepped into the corridor and made my way toward the common room. The others were already awake, speaking in low voices while sorting through our supplies. Their faces looked less strained than usual, though there was still that familiar tension beneath the surface. Every day demanded focus, and none of us took that lightly. I greeted them quietly and began checking our equipment, noting what needed repair and what could last a bit longer. Routine kept us grounded, especially when uncertainty pressed in from all sides. We planned to stay near the house that day, using the time to reorganize our resources and rest. Even so, I kept my senses sharpened. I walked the perimeter of the property, observing the landscape in every direction. The frost had melted into thin droplets that clung to the grass, glistening in the pale morning light. The forest beyond the fence stood silent, its branches lightly swaying in the breeze. Although nothing seemed unusual, I remained cautious. Calm landscapes often hid the possibility of sudden change. When I returned inside, I found Anna preparing a simple meal while the others discussed practical tasks for the afternoon. We had grown skilled at dividing responsibilities without argument. Each person understood their role, and that shared understanding created a quiet sense of unity. As we ate, I listened to their voices, appreciating the rare ease that flowed between us. These small moments, soft conversation, warm food, shared glances, were what made the difficulties bearable. Later, I stepped outside again, this time heading toward the small barn that stood behind the house. We used it mainly for storage, but I liked to check it regularly. Inside, dust floated lazily through beams of filtered light. Wooden crates lined the walls, filled with tools and materials we had collected throughout our journey. I examined each one with care, ensuring everything remained organized. Stability came from preparation, and the more we minimized uncertainty inside the barn, the easier it became to face the uncertainty beyond it. After closing the door behind me, I walked toward the far edge of the property, where an old stone wall separated the land from a field of tall grass. The wind brushed through the blades, creating a whispering sound that made the entire field ripple like fabric. I leaned against the wall, letting myself breathe deeply. My thoughts drifted back to my family again, not with the heaviness that usually accompanied such memories, but with a gentle clarity. I remembered my mother's steady hands, my father's calm voice, and the sense of security I once took for granted. Those memories guided many of my choices now, reminding me to stay patient and to protect the people who depended on me. As the afternoon progressed, clouds gathered overhead, casting a muted grey tone across the landscape. I glanced upward, noting the shift. Weather often changed quickly in this region, and I knew it was best to prepare for rain. I returned to the house, informing the group so we could secure anything left outside. Together we moved through the yard, storing equipment and checking that the shutters were firmly closed. The wind grew stronger, carrying the first hints of moisture. Once everything was safe indoors, we settled in for the evening. The room filled with the warm glow of a small lamp, its light reflecting softly off the walls. We spoke quietly about the past week, reviewing what we had accomplished and what still required attention. Our discussions remained practical, focused on planning, safety, and the steady progress we aim to maintain. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just the thoughtful approach that had kept us moving forward. As the rain began tapping against the roof, I sat by the window and watched the droplets race down the glass. The steady rhythm created a soothing backdrop, helping me sort through the day's thoughts. I felt grateful for the shelter, for the people around me, and for the resilience we continued to build, even though challenges remained ahead. Moments like this reminded me that perseverance was not built in grand gestures, but in quiet, daily choices. Before heading to bed, I stepped outside one last time, standing beneath the small overhang that protected the doorway. The rain had intensified, creating a soft roar across the yard. I closed my eyes and let the cool air wash over me, feeling a mixture of determination and calm settle within. Despite everything we had faced, we were still here, still steady, still focused, still committed to making each day count. When I finally returned inside, I felt ready for whatever the next morning would bring. I lay down and let my thoughts drift, knowing that rest was not a luxury but a necessity. As sleep slowly approached, I held onto the quiet conviction that, even in uncertainty, purpose could be found in every mindful step. The morning after the storm felt unusually calm, as if the world had paused to take a slow breath. When I opened the door, the air carried the clean scent of rainfall, and the ground shone with thin layers of moisture that reflected the pale sky. I stepped outside carefully, listening to the soft echoes of droplets still falling from the trees. It was a peaceful scene, and for a moment I allowed myself to absorb it, letting the steady quiet settle into my thoughts. Inside the house, the others were already awake, moving about with a quiet sense of purpose. The storm had kept us indoors longer than expected, so everyone seemed eager to resume their tasks. I joined them at the table, where a simple breakfast had been prepared. As we ate, we discussed the plan for the day, keeping our focus on the practical needs that continued to guide our pace. These steady routines mattered more than we always admitted. They grounded us when the days felt uncertain. Once we finished, I stepped outside again to inspect the yard. The storm had scattered leaves across the ground and pushed branches into small piles along the fence. I began gathering them, content with the familiar rhythm of work. The others soon joined me, and together we restored order to the space. It wasn't a demanding task, but it created a sense of progress, something that helped strengthen our determination. Even small accomplishments held meaning when life required constant vigilance. Later in the morning, I walked to the far edge of the property, following the narrow path that curved behind a group of old oak trees. This had become one of my favorite places to think. The earth was soft beneath my shoes, still damp but firm enough to walk without slipping. The trees rose high above me, their branches spread wide like protective arms. I paused beneath them and let my thoughts drift toward the past again. My mother's calm voice echoed in my memory, reminding me of her unspoken strength. Her steady presence shaped so much of who I became, even in the moments when she kept certain truths hidden. As I stood there, the breeze shifted slightly, carrying with it a faint melody of birdsong. It was such a simple sound, yet it tugged at something deep within me. I realized how rare it was to hear something so gentle, so free of tension. The melody lingered long enough to soften the rigid edges of my concentration, encouraging me to reflect on how far we had come. Despite the challenges, despite the unanswered questions, we had managed to create a small oasis of stability here. When I returned to the house, the group had begun organizing supplies inside the living room. I helped them sort through the items, checking for anything that needed replacement or repair. The work required patience, attention to detail, and a careful handle things I had learned to value over the years. We worked in near silence, not out of discomfort, but because each of us understood the importance of staying focused. Quiet cooperation had become one of our greatest strengths. By midday, the clouds parted enough to let thin strands of sunlight reach the ground. The light filtered through the windows in soft, wavering patterns. It felt like an invitation to step outside once more, and so I did. I walked toward the small hill near the barn, where the grass had begun to dry. From the top, I could see the distant line of the forest stretching far into the horizon. The view filled me with a mix of longing and steadiness, longing for the certainty of answers. Steadiness from knowing I would face them when the time came. As I stood on the hill, memories of my father surfaced again. They were never loud or overwhelming, but rather subtle impressions that rose unexpectedly. The warmth of his hand on my shoulder, the way he glanced at my mother during quiet conversations, the calm expression he wore when reading the newspaper. These memories felt distant, like fragments of a forgotten world, yet they still held power. I wondered again which parts of him my mother had tried to protect me from. The unanswered question continued to rest at the center of my journey. The afternoon passed quietly. We remained near the house, repairing small items, reviewing our notes, and discussing the next steps in an organized, measured manner. Each task was approached with care, without rushing or unnecessary risk. I noticed how much more confident we had become in our routines. The slower pace taught us to appreciate stability rather than constantly searching for dramatic moments. Life didn't need to move fast to hold meaning. Sometimes steadiness was its own form of strength. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the yard, we gathered inside for the evening. The warmth of the lamp illuminated the walls in a gentle glow, creating an atmosphere that felt safe. We spoke quietly about the day's progress, acknowledging both the tasks completed and those still ahead. I listened to the voices around me, feeling grateful for the sense of unity we had built. These were people I trusted, people whose presence reminded me that resilience often grew in shared determination. Before retiring for the night, I stood once more at the window, watching the landscape soften beneath the twilight. The sky shifted through tones of gold and soft blue, blending into the calm of approaching darkness. I breathed in slowly, allowing the serenity to settle deep within me. Though the path ahead still held uncertainties, I felt prepared to face them with clarity and patience. When I finally lay down, the quiet of the house wrapped around me like a gentle shield. My thoughts drifted toward the unanswered truths about my father, but they no longer stirred the same confusion as before. Instead, they created a steady resolve, one that guided me toward the next chapter of this journey, ready for whatever truths waited to be uncovered. The next morning arrived with a muted grey sky that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. I woke earlier than usual, stirred by a quiet sense of anticipation I couldn't quite explain. The air inside the house felt still, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something. I dressed slowly, taking in the faint scent of the wooden floorboards and the cool touch of the morning air against my skin. When I stepped into the corridor, I found the house silent. The others were still asleep. I moved quietly into the kitchen and warmed water for tea, letting the steam rise in gentle curls. As I waited, I looked out the window toward the fields beyond the property. The grass lay flattened in certain places where the night wind had pressed against it. The sky held a softness that reminded me of early mornings from my childhood, when I would sit beside my mother as she prepared breakfast. The memory came unexpectedly, filling me with a familiar, aching warmth. Even in those early years, there had been something guarded in her expression, a kind of gentle vigilance that I didn't understand until much later. Once the tea was ready, I carried the cup outside and sat on the small bench by the door. The cool air wrapped around me, and the quiet expanded into something almost tangible. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the distant rustle of leaves. In the stillness, thoughts of my father surfaced again. They never appeared as fully formed memories, more like fragments of Presence's voice, the outline of his uniform in a faded photograph, the subtle shift in my mother's shoulders whenever his name was mentioned. Each fragment held a weight that shaped the rhythm of my days. After some time, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Anna, her expression soft with the lingering effects of sleep. She joined me on the bench, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. We didn't need many words between us. The shared understanding that guided our days made conversation feel almost optional. Eventually, she returned inside to prepare breakfast, and I followed a few minutes later, feeling more grounded. Once everyone was awake, we began reviewing the tasks for the day. The storm from 2 days earlier had left debris scattered across the northern side of the property, and we decided to clear it before the next rainfall. The work required steady effort rather than strength, which suited us well. We walked toward the edge of the property with tools in hand, our footsteps creating a soft rhythm on the damp ground. As we worked, I noticed a small cluster of wildflowers growing near the base of an old tree. Their pale colors stood out against the darker soil, a subtle reminder that life continued even after harsh storms. The sight brought an unexpected sense of comfort. I crouched beside them, brushing my fingertips lightly over one of the petals. Something about their quiet resilience mirrored the thoughts that had followed me for days. By midday, the sky brightened slightly, allowing thin rays of sunlight to break through the clouds. We paused to rest, sitting on the grass near the large oak at the center of the property. The breeze was steady, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp soil. As I leaned back against the tree trunk, I felt a slow calm spread through me. These moments of stillness had become essential, giving us the space to reflect without urgency while resting there. My thoughts drifted again to the question that had shadowed much of my life. Why had my mother hidden the truth about my father? She had always spoken of him with a mixture of affection and careful restraint, like someone holding a fragile object they feared might shatter. Growing up, I sensed there was more behind her guarded expression, but she never let the truth slip. It wasn't until I reached adulthood, long after her passing, that I realized the depth of what she had chosen to protect. In the afternoon, I walked alone along the narrow path that curved behind the barn. The grass brushed softly against my legs, and the sky had taken on a gentle silver hue. I found myself thinking about the delicate balance between memory and revelation. When I was younger, I believed the truth was always clear, always absolute. But age had shown me that some truths carried weight not because they were hidden, but because they needed to be approached with care. As I reached the far edge of the property, I paused beside the stone wall that marked the boundary. From there, I could see the rolling hills stretching out in the distance, their muted colors blending into the horizon. The wind shifted, bringing with it a faint echo of something familiar, not a sound exactly, but more of a feeling. It reminded me of the quiet evenings when my mother would sit alone by the window, staring out at nothing in particular. Those moments always felt heavy, as though she were holding onto a memory too complicated to speak aloud. Returning to the house, I found the others preparing dinner. The glow of the lamp illuminated their faces, casting warm light across the room. We ate quietly, discussing the tasks we had completed and planning what we might do the next day. Even in these simple routines, I felt a sense of purpose. The predictability offered comfort in contrast to the uncertainty that lingered in my thoughts. Later that evening, I stood by the window once more, watching the landscape fade into dusk. The colors softened gradually, shifting from muted gold to early evening blue. I pressed my hand lightly against the glass, allowing the cool surface to ground me. My mind wandered to the documents I had yet to examine, the ones that might hold the missing pieces of my father's story. Though the truth remained out of reach for now, I sensed that I was drawing closer to understanding why my mother had chosen silence. When night finally settled, I lay down with a sense of quiet determination. The house around me was peaceful, the walls steady and familiar. My thoughts softened into a calm resolve. Whatever truth waited ahead, I would face it with clarity, patience, and a willingness to understand the choices of the past. The following morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as though the sky itself had decided to lift the weight that had lingered over the landscape these past days. I awoke earlier than usual, stirred by an inner pull I couldn't quite name. It wasn't urgency, and it wasn't tear anxiety, more like a quiet insistence that the day ahead would hold something I needed to confront. With that thought resting in the back of my mind, I rose from bed and stepped into the hallway, listening to the gentle hum of the house as it awakened around me. I made my way into the kitchen, where soft morning light filtered through the curtains. The warmth of it settled gently on the wooden countertop, reminding me of mornings from my childhood when I would watch my mother prepare tea before the day fully began. There was a steadiness in those memories, a simple rhythm that shaped the early years of my life. Even now, decades later, I could picture her movements with absolute clarity, the way she lifted the kettle, the way she always paused for a moment before pouring, as though that brief stillness allowed her to gather strength. I prepared my own tea with similar care, aware of how deeply her influence lived in me. The steam rose in slow spirals, and I wrapped my hands around the warm cup as I stepped outside. The air held a crisp freshness, touched by the remnants of the previous night's breeze. From the porch, I could see the distant line of hills, their shapes softened by the early light. The landscape felt vast yet familiar, like a place designed to hold questions safely until one was ready to face them. As I drank the tea, my thoughts drifted toward the documents I had kept tucked away inside my bag. For days I had avoided opening them, sensing that the truth within them carried a weight that deserved the right moment. But something about this morning, the steadiness in the sky, the calm in my chest, told me that the moment had arrived. I didn't feel fear, only a sober acceptance that whatever I discovered would shape my path forward. Inside, the others began to stir. I heard quiet footsteps, soft whispers, and the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared. I greeted them with a nod and a gentle smile before retrieving the small folder from my belongings. Its edges were worn from age, yet the clasp remained firm, as though it had always been meant to be opened with intention rather than haste. I carried it to the table and sat down, breathing steadily. The room around me faded into the background as I opened the folder and unfolded the first document. The paper was yellowed, its ink slightly faded, but the handwriting was still legible. It wasn't my father's handwriting, at least not the handwriting I remembered from the single letter he had sent before his departure. This writing felt more official, more structured. It belonged to someone who sought to record facts carefully. The document began with my father's name, followed by a series of dates and brief descriptions. They outlined his assignments abroad, each location listed with clinical clarity. I read each line slowly, absorbing the timeline of his service. There were places I had heard mentioned throughout my life, and others that felt unfamiliar. What struck me most was how ordinary the descriptions sounded. There were no dramatic statements, no alarming revelations, just a record of responsibilities carried out with diligence. Still, as I continued reading, a subtle shift emerged. The tone of the later entries changed, becoming less detailed, as though certain information had been intentionally condensed. It wasn't alarming, but it suggested that some aspects of his service had been handled quietly. That realization lingered in my mind like a shadow. I set the first document aside and opened the next. This one appeared to be a letter not from my father, but from someone who had worked closely with him. The writer described my father as reliable, steady, and deeply committed to his duties. They mentioned his tendency to carry burdens silently, choosing not to share concerns, even when doing so might have lightened them. As I read those lines, a gentle ache formed in my chest. It echoed something my mother once said, that my father believed in carrying weight without complaint. The letter continued, explaining that he had faced several difficult decisions during his time abroad. None of them were described in detail, but the writer expressed respect for the way he handled each situation with careful judgment. The message ended with a note of gratitude, thanking him for his service and expressing hope that his family would one day understand the depth of his character. I read the final sentence several times, letting the words sink in. It wasn't the revelation I expected, but it held a quiet power. For so long, I had imagined that my mother's secrecy stemmed from something heavy or troubling, yet the truth unfolding before me suggested something different, something rooted not in shame or fear, but in a desire to protect the dignity of the man she loved. I placed the letter down and exhaled slowly. The room felt larger somehow, as though the truth had opened a door inside me. My mother's silence was not an attempt to hide something harmful. It was a way of safeguarding the memory of a man who carried weight with grace. She had preserved his story not by telling it, but by honoring the things he never felt comfortable sharing. When I stepped outside again, the sky had brightened, casting warm light across the property. I walked toward the hill near the barn, carrying with me a sense of quiet understanding. The landscape stretched out in calm waves, steady and enduring. As I stood there, I realized that I no longer felt the ache of uncertainty. Instead, I felt grounded, rooted in the truth I had uncovered, and ready to continue this journey with clarity. The wind brushed gently against my face, carrying the faint scent of grass and earth. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel clouded by unanswered questions. It felt open, steady, and shaped by the quiet strength of the past. I woke before dawn, long before the others stirred, with a kind of heaviness I had not felt since the earliest days of the conflict. By then, our small group had grown accustomed to the rhythm of uncertainty, yet that particular morning carried a different weight. I sensed it as soon as I opened my eyes, as if the air itself had thickened. Even the distant rumble that usually echoed from beyond the hills had quieted, leaving only the soft creaking of the old wooden beams above my head. I waited a moment before rising, listening carefully, trying to understand why my pulse had already quickened. It felt as though the past days had been building toward something I had not yet named. When I stepped outside, the ground was still damp from the night's condensation, and a thin mist lingered near the trees. The sky carried that early shade of grey that comes just before the first line of sunlight appears. I walked toward the small ridge behind our makeshift shelter, hoping a higher view would help me make sense of the unease settling in my chest. From up there, I could see the abandoned road stretching across the valley, a thin dividing line between what was familiar and what remained unpredictable. Nothing moved along it, yet the silence felt unusual, as if the world were holding its breath. I stayed on the ridge longer than I expected. Long enough for the sun to push through the horizon and paint the fields with a muted gold. Only then did I finally turn back. Inside the shelter, the others had begun waking. They moved quietly, each carrying the exhaustion of too many restless nights. When they noticed I had already been outside, they asked if anything seemed different. I told them only what I felt confident saying, that the morning was still, that the usual distant noise had faded, and that we should remain cautious. Even mild reassurance meant something in those days. As we prepared a modest breakfast, the atmosphere inside shifted from grogginess to a kind of subdued focus. We had made it through several difficult weeks, and though our supplies were low, our spirits had gradually stabilized. Still, there was an unspoken understanding that calm rarely lasted. Moments of peace often arrived just before another unpredictable turn, and all of us sensed that pattern far too well. I watched each person settle into their tasks with quiet concentration. The routine brought a fragile sense of normalcy. Late in the morning, while checking the perimeter, I noticed footprints near the edge of the woods. They were faint but recent. My first instinct was to call for the others, but something urged me to observe more carefully before making a decision. I followed the prints a short distance until they blended into the undergrowth. I found no signs of disturbance beyond that, no broken branches or displaced soil, only the faint impressions of someone passing through. When I returned to the group, I described what I had seen. We agreed to heighten our attention, but not to assume immediate danger. Our goal, after all, had always been to avoid unnecessary fear. Throughout the afternoon, we worked on small tasks that helped maintain our shelter, reinforcing the beams, checking water containers, and sorting what little food we had left. I tried to focus on these tasks, but the earlier unease lingered. Every so often, I paused to listen, hoping for a clue about what might be approaching. What troubled me most was not the possibility of encountering someone unknown, but the uncertainty of their intentions. Encounters in those times could range from supportive to deeply unsettling, and we had no reliable way to anticipate which kind we might face. As daylight faded, we gathered for a simple evening meal. The atmosphere grew quieter, as if each of us were trying to process thoughts we had not spoken aloud. The youngest among us asked whether we might move to a safer location soon. I told the truth that we were exploring options but needed to confirm which direction would offer the least risk. The answer brought a small measure of comfort, though I could see the worry pressing behind their eyes. I felt responsible for their safety, for every decision we made together. When night finally settled, a cold breeze swept through the valley. The sounds that returned were different from the ones we had grown used to hearing, subtle, irregular, almost cautious. I stayed awake longer than the others, listening to each shift in the wind. My thoughts drifted between the footprints earlier that day and the strange calm of the morning. It was as if the world around us was preparing for some silent change, something that would alter our path in ways we did not yet understand. Near midnight, a faint light flickered far beyond the ridge, barely visible through the trees. It was not bright enough to signal urgency, yet it was distinct enough to hold my full attention. I watched it for several minutes, trying to determine whether it moved. The light seemed steady, almost controlled, like someone using it with purpose. I considered waking the others, but chose instead to observe quietly. After a short while, the light disappeared, leaving the darkness undisturbed. I returned inside and sat near the wall, letting my mind sift through what I had seen. It could have been travelers, or someone searching for shelter, or even someone marking a location. The possibilities were countless, but what mattered was preparing ourselves calmly, without panic and without assumptions. That responsibility had carried me through every challenge. As I finally lay down, I felt the same weight that had greeted me at dawn, only now it shaped itself into a quiet resolution. Whatever tomorrow brought, we would face it with the same determination that had carried us this far. The night closed in, and with it came a strange, steady confidence that, despite the unknown, we still had the strength to continue forward, one careful step at a time.